So welcome to the Practical Promises Review. We're going to go through these one at a time, starting off with this is the um, non-permissified version for exercise A. So we start out by looking at this code. We can see that what it's doing is it's reading this file, sort of standard read file with an error and the results. And here we are greening this out with the stanza. So we want to also do the permissified version of this. So before we get started, let me just do a couple things here that I found to be kind of helpful. For some reason, I kept on misspelling this, so I'm just going to call this P read file. And there's a couple of other things that I'll end up doing as we get a little farther along. But so what I want to do here is that we have a permissified version of this, which again, the way that you sort of could tell in your code that something is using a promise is that if you then see the word then after calling a function, odds are there's a promise library somewhere that's implemented this as opposed to passing in a callback. So if we take this, and I'm going to comment out this version, and let's call this P read file. And what we're going to do here is, after we end up calling this, since this is a promise, we have a then, and there's no requirement for this test that this ends up getting written out as a doing anything with an error message. So let's just change this, a promise version. And so here we've got our function, it's thenable, we've passed a callback here to our then. And so when this promise is fulfilled, we should see the permissified version. Now, it's pretty good and it works, but we can actually make this a little bit simpler. So one of the things that you realize is that this parameter that goes to the then is a function, and it's going to get past the resolved value of the promise. So you could make this a little bit shorthand for a promise. You don't have this option with the non-permissified version because you have to deal with catching errors. But the parameter that ends up getting passed to this callback function is going to be the result of the resolved promise. And that allows us to do something like this, which really looks a lot cleaner. So again, when this file gets read, if in fact things went well, and again, we're not dealing with errors here, we're going to end up seeing our results. And as a result, this should end up working. There's one other thing that I want to do here, I found this to be kind of helpful. So there's some randomness that's built into this process, but sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of control over that. So one of the things we could do is, let's just say that I wanted to do something like this. I wanted to sort of create my own randomness. And so I wanted to be able to pass 2 seconds and say, hey, look, this is not going to get resolved for 2 seconds. So it's not going to work right now, but without actually breaking any other code, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my utilities. And what I'm going to do is that when I call this, I'm going to pass in a value of random extra time. Now, again, if I didn't pass this in, this is going to have a undefined value. But when I end up calling this permissify, this actual underlying read file, what I'm going to do is pass this in as well. So now there's a third parameter, which I might or I might not have passed in, called random extra time. And the only thing I'm going to do here, and we've seen this before, is that I'll just ask if this exists. And if it exists, I'll end up using it. If not, I'll end up using this value. So again, just something so that I could actually see that this is, I could actually control this time, and I think it just becomes useful for some of the other exercises here. So now if we do this, we should see a delay of 2 seconds. Now if I really wanted to exaggerate the hell out of this thing, you know, I could do that. Set it to 5 seconds, waste a little bit of time. And you get the result. So again, you don't have to use this, but I found it useful in some of the other exercises. There's a couple of other things I'm going to do here as well. So now we've got another scenario where here we are getting the results from stanza 2 and stanza 3, and we're not really concerned about the order at all. So if I went over here, so sometimes here we have 3-2, 3-2 again. Now we've got 2-3. Okay, so we could see this is going to be random here. Again, we could sort of fix this and control our randomness, which we'll maybe do in a second. But before we do that, let's comment this out, and we're going to do our permissified version of this. So I'm going to take this. Let's actually just copy this. And for the promise version, this is going to be P, read file. And again, I'm going to be able to use my then, because that's what you get with a promise. So let's get rid of this callback here. And again, I'm going to use my, I'm just going to pass in green because I'm going to have my result passed in here. So I can do this, green. So now I've got stanza 2. Again, it might be a little faster or slower because there's some randomness that's built in. And I'm going to do the same thing here. And this is going to be, again, my P read file. So let's just clean that up. So again, if we run this, the order should be somewhat random. 3-2, 3-2, 2-3. Again, if you wanted to sort of control this and say, hey, look, I'm going to make sure that this ends up getting read slower, you could go in here and, you know, sort of control the test a little bit by, you know, maybe saying this is going to be 2 seconds, and in this case, 3 is always going to be before 2. So again, I found that helpful if you just wanted to have a little bit more control over that. But take that out. So now we're doing something serially. So we're going to go in and we're going to read 2. We're going to print out the results. And then we're going to read 3. And we're going to print out the results. And then when we're done, we're going to want to call a function that says we're done. And another thing that I found to be helpful here was to actually, in my utils, just because I was doing this a bunch of times, to specify done here. And I'm going to use chalk, and I'm going to log chalk, magenta, done. Okay, so save this guy, go back here, and so now I'm going to do my permissified version of this. So again, what we're looking at, one of the things that we get to avoid when we end up using promises is this whole idea of getting into this sort of callback hell, where you've got this callback here, and within this callback, you have another callback. With promises, things become a lot more linear. So let's comment out this guy here. And I'm going to go in and copy this. Let's actually run that first. I don't think I did that. So this is going to be C. Right, so we end up getting 2, 3, and it's always going to be in that order because one is nested within the other. And just to actually see that we can end up using our utils, let's actually go up here and grab it in here. So I'm going to put this done function here, and this is going to be equal to exercise utils done. Okay, and let's just see if we could use that. So now this is problem C, and instead of saying console.log, let's just call done. Okay, that's good. Gives us a little bit more indication of what's happening there. And we can go here. I'm going to comment this out, and we'll see how this just is going to read a lot better. And since it's going to read a lot better, it's also going to be a lot easier to maintain. So again, you have a hint here. You don't have to nest these calls. And here is stanza 2. And since it's a promise, it's thenable. And I'm going to green that out. And after this, I'm going to do another promise here. And it's important that if you want these things to be linear, you really have to return another promise from here. What ends up happening with the then, when things become chained, is that if you didn't return anything, as far as it's concerned, it's a resolved promise with a value of undefined. But if we end up returning this promise, it won't go down to the next level until this ends up getting resolved. And this is probably something that you saw in terms of going through this workshop. But let's now get our second promise here. So we've got this first promise, we're greening it out. Then we end up doing our second promise, and we're going to green this out. And then when we are done, we can specify done. And you can see that just in terms of doing this, I think that it becomes a lot more apparent what's going on here. This file gets read, we green it out. We end up then wanting to read this file, we green it out, and then we want to have the message done. So now if I run this, right, I've got 2 and 3. It's always going to be in that order. And again, if you just sort of wanted to see these come in a little bit slower, you could add a little bit of a delay here, right? So if I said, let me wait 1 second for this, And let me wait 2 seconds for this. You'll sort of see these come in, and it might be just a little bit more apparent that one is really happening right after the other, and here we just get a little bit more control over how they end up printing out. And usually you would end up, it's also worth noting that usually you would, one reason why you would make these serial is maybe the data that you were getting from reading one file is going to be used to pass into another promise. This is not really the case here, just an exercise. But again, I think the big takeaway here is that, since you don't have to do any sort of sniffing as to, and even though we're not doing it here, I mean, we're not checking for errors here, but this, the signature of this callback function, we have to specify, where we don't really have to specify the signature for green, because if this gets resolved, what's going to end up getting passed in here is the text. And again, we could just say, hey, look, call this green function. Whether or not we wrap this in a function with the results doesn't really matter. It's still going to end up greening this out. So let's take a look. Now we start getting into errors here. So this is going to be D. Okay. So here we've got an error because this file doesn't exist. So there's a couple of different ways that you can end up doing this in the permissified version. And let's go and comment this out. And in our promise version, we're going to do P, read file. All right, it's the wrong file name. And what I'm going to do is say, hey, look, if we were successful, we're going to green it out. Otherwise, we're going to red it out. So the way that the promise libraries work, or the way that they're implemented, is that you could pass in a function for if this promise ends up getting resolved, and you could add another function if it doesn't end up getting resolved. The first function will end up getting passed the resolved result, and the second function will end up getting passed the rejected reason. So in this case, we could go over here and we could run this. And, sorry about that, this is going to be D, right? We end up getting this error. Now, there's also a couple of different ways that you could do this. You could also say green and catch red. Okay, you end up getting the same results. And I just also want to point something else out. When you have a promise chain, if you have an error, once you deal with that error, you could still go through and add other things to the promise chain. As far as the promise chain is concerned, if you end up dealing with an error, you could still go through to the next promise. So if I was to do this and then put in done, right? Done would end up getting called here. So that's something to be aware of. And again, whether or not you do this here or with catch, either way will end up working. But again, it's important to note that once you end up, what'll happen is that if you have an error, it's going to look for the first spot to land with that error. So it's going to look either for a then with a second parameter, or it's going to look for a catch. But once it lands there, again, if you have the rest of the promise chain there, it's still going to get called. That's something else that's something that you really have to be aware of. Okay, so let's switch this back to this guy. And let's move on now to E. So we take a look down here. So again, we're going to do something serial here. We're going to read and log stanza 3, and then we're going to read and log stanza 4, or we're going to log an error. So you can sort of see here, we go through here, if there's an error, this was a callback, we never make it into this inner callback. So if there's an error, we want to write out the error. So in this case, we've read stanza 3. If there's no error, we green it out. Otherwise, and then at that point, we would try to read this and do the same thing. So this becomes a lot, I think, easier to read when using the permissified version of this. So here, I'm going to copy and paste this so I know I'm using the right files. And so if I go in here, I'm going to say, let's green this out. And then I'm going to put a then in here. And I'm going to copy this line over here. So I have the right file, which in fact is the wrong file. And again, this is going to be the pread. And this has to be returned. Otherwise, it's going to be immediately resolved, and I'm not going to have the value that I want. And so the way that you can do this is that if we're able to read this file, we'll do then, and we'll end up doing green. But we could also specify if there's an error, right? If this is going to get rejected, pass me back the rejected reason. Let's just fix this comma here. So this should end up getting read. Now again, if there was an error and this didn't exist, it's going to look for a place to fall. It's not going to find it here. It's not going to find it here, but it will find it here. So let's actually run this. And let me fix this guy here. Okay, so that's fine. That's what we expect. That's what we ended up getting from the other one as well. But just so you could see this, if it turned out that this was a bad file, you could see that it doesn't attempt to go through and read the other file, which is exactly what the callback version was doing. Now let's just fix that so it's correct here. And the only difference between this one, this is really the exact same version. The only difference is that we want to end up calling done when we're done here. So these are, I think, in fact, the same stanzas here. We could actually go in here. Let's actually just run that just to make sure that this version is working as is. Okay. So the key thing here is that we want to end up calling done when this is done. And we could do that. And again, I think this indicates the fact that when you end up catching an error, you can keep on moving down the promise chain. So this is going to be the same thing. The only difference with this version is that once we end up handling an error, if an error occurs, it could occur on the first one or the second one. We know, in fact, it's going to be the second poem where you have an error. But in this case, we could say done. And let's go and comment this out. And in this case, we end up getting that same result. So for these exercise 2 examples, we're going to end up reading this first example, we're going to end up reading our files in parallel. Now, we were actually able to do that before, but we didn't end up doing anything in terms of when they were both read. We didn't have a mechanism to do that before. So if we end up looking at this exercise, and actually some of you might have gotten this too, is that this is an async library which allows us to take functions, and if they're asynchronous, to group them together. So in this case, we have this async each, which ends up taking this array, and we're going to end up generating these callback functions with this library. And we're going to end up getting some results when these end up getting called, and we're going to specify when each of these functions is done. And so, again, this is an async library, but we're going to do this, and our code's going to be a little bit cleaner if we end up using a promise library to get the same result. So let's install this. And let's try this again. Okay, so these things are running. They're going to be running in parallel. What this means is that we should end up getting, should be different order. So we have 2, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. Okay, so the order is randomized here. And let's find a way that we could do this by using the promise library. Well, the way that you could run things in parallel with the promise library is that you can use promise.all. And again, usually you're going to end up running something in parallel if there's no dependency on these two different things. Let's comment this out. And we're going to do something similar here, except we've got a reference to our promise library up here. And the Bluebird library has something called promise.all. And what promise.all does is it takes an array and of promises, and when all those promises are done, it'll end up passing the results in, let's call this results, because this is going to be an array of results. And so in this case, what we're going to do here is that we're going to take this array of file names, and let's go inside here. And what we can do is we can take our file names and we can map them. So now we have a file name. And what we're going to do is we're going to generate promises from this. So the map function actually will map an array into another array, but this we want to be an array of promises. So we're going to say return, and I'm going to modify some things up here, but this is going to be p read file name. And we'll take a look and we'll console out the results just so we can see what it looks like. So this is gonna be asynchronous. And so if we go up here, let's just call this P, read file. Let me bring my done in here as well. So this is, we should be able to go through here. Here's our callback version. These are going to be our results. I'm going to modify this in a bit, but let's just test this out. Console It's not defined as a method. Console.log should be. Okay, so these are our results. Now, again, if we wanted this to be run, this is always going to be in the same order. Okay? Our results are always going to be in the same order because this is what promise.all does. But what we can do here is we can specify that we want to return and we want to green these out. So in which case, if we run this, again, the green console.log doesn't give us any results, so we don't have any results here, but our code could be pretty clean. And again, the order here, we should be able to randomize this. So we got 1, 2, 2, 1, which is what we got in the other results. Again, the goal here is, hey, look, if you were able to go through these things, these are parallel. When we get the results, we want to deal with the results, in which case our permissified version becomes a lot cleaner. And we could specify when we're done, we're just going to call done. So promise.all allows you to run promises in parallel. So you've got 1, 2, 2, 1, which is exactly the same effect that we had when we end up doing the version, callback version, by using the async library. So let's take a look at the second exercise. Here we're reading all the files. Again, the order is going to be somewhat random depending on when these things end up running. But we're going to read these. Then when we're done, we're going to end up printing out done. This is almost the exact same thing that we did up here, where we're using promise.all, and we're going to green all these out, and then we're going to do done. So let's actually comment this. And again, we'll use the Bluebird library, promise.all. And this gets passed in an array. So let's create that array. So here are our file names. Let's actually go over here and we'll say file names. We're going to map a function. Here's a file name. And from within this, we're going to return a p read file of the file name. And we're going to then green it out. And when we are done with this, here's our promise.all. We could say then, and then we could say done. And this should get us to the exact same thing. Again, here's all the promises that we're reading out of all these files. This is being done, again, as they end up getting read, they're going to get printed out. And since there's some randomness that's built in here, we should see that these come in different orders. But again, when we're done, we end up printing out done. So that works out well here, and you can see how much simpler this is just in terms of dealing with this. Again, the key here is that whenever you're using a promise.all, what you're going to want to have is you're going to want to have an array, and you're going to want to have an array of promises. Again, we don't have any results here. We could end up actually getting an array of results, but we don't have any results here because this, when we end up getting this file, we end up printing it out. And the fact is that these individually are promise chains, and this second part of the promise chain is a console.log, which would end up just giving us undefined anyway. So, I mean, if you wanted to see that, we could go in here and we could actually give this a function just to show you what I'm talking about here. If I put in results, console log results, and then I end up calling done, you would see that these are just all undefined because, again, console.log doesn't end up returning anything. That doesn't really look that pretty, so let's just switch this back. And now, again, we've got the random results. So this is actually my favorite example, where we're going to be reading these things serially, and we want to do it with the permissified version. And before we do it, I just want to point something out, is that in the promise library, there is this idea that we can resolve a promise right away, and we can green it out. So let's actually comment this version out so we can actually see that, even though it was there, it was all the way on the top. So we can green this out, or we could red it out, or we could just print done if we wanted to, however we want to do that. The bottom line is that we could sort of start this promise chain. And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to use the reduce function. So we're going to take our file names, we're going to reduce them. And the way that the reduce function works is that we're going to sort of build up this value, which we're going to be able to access with the variable memo here. This is going to give us our file name. And so the second parameter here is we're going to start out with a resolved promise. We don't really care what the value is. We just want to start out with a resolved promise. And what we're going to do here is we're going to take our memo, and we'll say memo.then, and we're going to create a function here. And what we're going to return from this is our p read file, file name, then we're going to green it out. So what we're doing here is we're building up our memo, we're going to return our memo. So again, if you take the example of this resolved promise coming through, the resolved promise comes through, it's resolved, and we end up calling this. But again, it's not going to go to the next level in the chain until it's done with the prior level. So if we just did this, file name is not resolved. So this is not file name, this is file names. That's what we're reducing, the array. If we did this, we're going to get these in order. And really simply, and again, the key thing here is that when you then this, right, you have this other function that you're dynamically creating. Closure allows us to get access to this file name. And what we can do here is that simply when we're done with all this, we could specify done, and these go through, and this prints out done. I mean, if you wanted to, you can make this either more or less dramatic, whatever you think. We have this delay that we could build in so that this is going to print out one right after the other. And maybe it's just a little bit more apparent how this is working. But that's actually an interesting one. And again, the key thing here is that we're wrapping this inside of this function, right? Where because again, this, when you have a then, you have a callback function, right? And we are dynamically generating this callback function. So this next one is pretty much the exact same thing, with the exception that one of these is going to end up randomly failing, right? Because we put a bad file name in here. And you could solve this pretty easily. Let's comment this one out. And here we just have to deal with what happens if there's an error. Again, just keep in mind that if there is an error, it's going to look for its first place to land here. So that I'm going to copy this. So here's our serialized version where we're not dealing with errors occurring. But if we go over here, I could specify we're going to call one of the things we could do here is that we could put a then. Actually, we could catch if we're red here, or even easier, actually. Well, no, this will make sense. So I made the mistake of commenting out my file names. And now, if my file names are not commented out, I'm just going in here and I'm going to end up catching any error that ends up occurring, and then I'm going to call done. So, again, where this fails depends on what file here. I randomly selected the first one. Right here, it's the fourth one, and it's going to be randomized here. But again, we're always going to get done at the end, and if you wanted to, this is going to be the equivalent of doing that. That's really what catch does, and you'll end up getting the same results. So for the permissified version of write file, it's very similar to what was done with the permissified version of read file. So this is actually the code that you could use to do this. So, in the end, if you're creating something if you're taking something that's asynchronous, you want to turn it into a promise, the way that you could do it with the Bluebird library is to generate a new promise. And when you call this, you're going to get passed in two functions. Okay, so you have a callback here, which is going to get passed in a resolve and a reject. Now it's up to you to either resolve or reject it. So in this case, we've got write file, which is an asynchronous, plain vanilla asynchronous version. Write file will write to a file. If in fact I have an error, I'm going to end up calling reject with that error, and I'll return. Otherwise, I'll end up resolving. Actually, I've done this once before, but if I end up running this, exercise E, and I just take a look at this file, foo.txt, right, I can see that I've randomly written out to it. So that's a sort of simplified version if you wanted to write a promise version of write file with the Bluebird library.